After 3 exhausting months overseas, I came home to find my suitcases dumped on the porch. They mistook my silence for surrender, assuming I was the weakest link in this bloodline. But staying quiet is never a concession. It is the steady sound of a trap being set. When you strip away everything a woman built, do not expect tears. Fear her instead, because you just freed her from every moral limit family ever imposed. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Natalie Simpson. I am 32 years old, and for the last decade, I have been the invisible spine of my family. The flight back from Europe took 14 hours, but the exhaustion settling deep inside my bones had been accumulating for 3 agonizing months. I had spent the entire financial quarter securing a massive, complex logistics contract for Viridia Nexus Solutions across 5 different time zones. My body was running on stale airplane coffee, adrenaline, and sheer willpower. Every muscle ached. Every joint screamed for rest. All I wanted was the quiet, predictable sanctuary of the family estate, nestled in the most expensive, heavily gated suburbs of Denver. The sprawling stone mansion, a monument to our supposed success, was supposed to be my refuge after 90 days of corporate warfare. Pulling the rental car up the long, winding driveway flanked by manicured pine trees, I expected the familiar, welcoming glow of the amber porch lights. I expected the heavy, custom-carved oak doors to swing open. Instead, the sprawling front of the house was cast in deep, forbidding shadows. The biting Colorado wind, carrying the bitter chill of early winter, whipped fiercely against my wool trench coat as I stepped out of the vehicle. There, sitting abandoned on the pristine, swept slate tiles of the front porch, were my 2 heavy leather suitcases, the very same bags I had packed 3 months ago. They looked like 2 dark tombstones placed deliberately at the threshold of my own home. A fluorescent yellow sticky note was slapped carelessly onto the retractable handle of the larger bag. It fluttered violently in the freezing wind. Even in the dim, unforgiving moonlight, I immediately recognized the jagged, frantic, almost childish handwriting. It belonged to my younger sister, Chloe. I leaned in closer, my breath pluming into thick white clouds in the freezing air, and read the exact words that would sever my bloodline forever. Family and company structure have changed. You no longer have shares or a place here. Do not knock. I stood frozen. The paralysis did not come from the plunging ambient temperature, but from the absolute, breathtaking audacity of the cheap piece of paper in front of me. The silence of the porch was suffocating, yet it was suddenly broken by a sound that made the muscles in my jaw clench tight. From the massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows of the formal living room to my right, a warm golden light spilled out onto the frost-covered lawn. Through the thick, soundproofed glass, I heard the sharp, unmistakable, high-pitched clink of expensive crystal wine glasses meeting in a toast. I heard laughter. It was faint, muffled by the heavily insulated walls, but I knew those voices intimately. My mother, Eleanor, letting out her signature airy, carefree chuckle. My stepfather, his voice booming, arrogant, and thick with expensive liquor. They were celebrating. They were actively toasting to my sudden exile, drinking the very wine my relentless hard work had paid for over the years. Most women would have shattered. Most would have marched up those steps, hammered their freezing fists against the heavy wood, and demanded answers. They would have screamed until their throats bled raw, begging for the warmth of the hearth they had painstakingly built. I did not shed a single, solitary tear. Crying requires a fundamental belief that something precious and pure has been lost. I felt no heartbreak. I only felt the cold, sharp, clinical clarity of a surgeon staring down at a malignant tumor that needed to be excised. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the camera application. I adjusted the focus manually, ensuring the harsh flash captured every single jagged letter of Chloe's handwriting in the highest resolution possible. I needed a digital fossil of their betrayal, a permanent, undeniable receipt of the exact moment they declared war. Without a single backward glance at the glowing window, I grabbed the cold metal handles of my luggage. The heavy wheels rattled loudly, aggressively against the exposed aggregate pavement, a harsh, grating sound that I sincerely hoped echoed straight into their cozy, fire-lit living room. I loaded the heavy bags into the trunk of my rental sedan, the heavy thud sounding exactly like a heavy wooden gavel dropping in an empty, echoing courtroom. I slipped into the leather driver's seat, turned the ignition, and drove away from the only physical home I had ever known. The heated seat slowly thawed my numb fingers, but my mind remained entirely encased in absolute ice. I did not drive to a sympathetic friend's house to weep on their couch. I drove straight into the concrete heart of downtown Denver, pulling up to an exclusive, discreetly managed private hotel that catered to high-net-worth ghosts. I paid for a top-floor suite in cash for the first night. Once inside the sterile, immaculately clean, luxurious room, I set my heavy bags down on the carpet. I did not bother to unpack. Instead, I sat on the rigid edge of the king-sized bed, pulled out my phone, and popped open the side tray with a metal pin. I extracted my old SIM card. I stared at the tiny piece of gold and plastic for a long, quiet second. It held all the family group chats, the emergency contacts, the invisible strings of emotional control they used to keep me working tirelessly while they played. I snapped it cleanly in half between my fingernails and dropped the broken pieces into the bottom of the brass trash can. I walked slowly over to the expansive floor-to-ceiling window. The sprawling city of Denver spread out endlessly beneath me, a vast, glowing grid of sparkling streetlights and moving shadows. The thick glass was soothingly cool against my forehead. Down there, millions of people were sleeping peacefully, fighting over petty things, loving blindly, and trusting their families implicitly. Tonight, looking down at the urban sprawl, I finally learned the hardest, most jagged truth of all. Blood does not make a family. Blood is merely a random biological coincidence. It does not forge loyalty, nor does it guarantee love. It only creates profound vulnerabilities, soft spots in your carefully constructed armor, and emotional weaknesses meticulously designed for other people to exploit. And as I watched the city lights flicker silently in the dark, I made a solemn, unbreakable promise to the shadows. They thought they had successfully locked me out in the cold. They did not realize they had just locked themselves in a cage with a predator. I walked away from the expansive glass window and retrieved my heavily modified, military-grade encrypted laptop from my leather carry-on bag. The sleek, matte black aluminum casing was freezing to the touch, a sharp contrast to the heated air of the hotel suite. I placed the machine on the heavy mahogany desk, flipped the screen open, and completely bypassed the standard biometric scanner. Instead, my fingers danced across the keyboard, typing a complex string of 64 alphanumeric characters. It was a master password I had memorized long ago and never written down on a single piece of paper. The screen flickered from absolute black to a sterile green text command line interface. I was not just logging into a computer. I was tunneling deep into an offshore, decentralized data server that I had quietly established exactly 5 years ago. It was a digital vault, utterly impenetrable to anyone lacking the specific, randomized encryption keys, and it held the absolute, unfiltered truth about my family. As the server directories rapidly populated on my screen, I allowed myself a brief, bitter recollection of how this entire empire was actually built. To the outside world, Simpson Heritage was a flawless beacon of luxury living. It was a highly coveted lifestyle brand that sold an expensive illusion of effortless, aristocratic elegance. If you opened any high-end fashion magazine, you would see my mother, Eleanor, draped in imported cashmere, posing gracefully in sunlit solariums. You would see my sister, Chloe, flashing her blinding, cosmetically perfected smile, aggressively marketing herself as the visionary creative director. They were the flawless, highly curated faces of the brand. They attended the exclusive charity galas, gave the vapid television interviews, and soaked up the endless public adoration. But aesthetics do not build corporate empires. Blood, sweat, and ruthless corporate maneuvering do. 7 years ago, Simpson Heritage was nothing but a disorganized collection of failing boutique stores, drowning in massive debt, and teetering precariously on the absolute brink of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was I who had to step into the smoking wreckage. While my mother and sister were busy selecting exotic floral arrangements for magazine photo shoots, I was sitting in cramped, windowless conference rooms. I was the one ruthlessly negotiating with aggressive creditors to restructure our massive, suffocating liabilities. I fired the incompetent executive officers my mother had hired out of misplaced loyalty. I completely rebuilt our global supply chain from the ground up, navigating treacherous international trade laws to secure offshore manufacturing deals that actually turned a profit. I drafted every single vendor contract, cleared every terrifying legal hurdle, and transformed a dying, bleeding vanity project into a highly lucrative, finely tuned corporate machine. I performed the grueling, invisible labor in the shadows so they could comfortably play pretend in the spotlight. I navigated past the server route and opened a secure digital folder labeled with the current fiscal year. My custom tracking software had been silently scraping every digital footprint, every corporate email, and every legal filing associated with the company's internal network. I pulled up the most recent board resolutions, documents that had been officially filed with the state registry during my exhausting 90-day absence in Europe. The harsh blue glow of the screen illuminated the sheer, breathtaking scale of Chloe's betrayal. Line by line, I read the carefully fabricated meeting minutes. Chloe had systematically orchestrated a hostile internal corporate takeover. She had drafted emergency corporate resolutions claiming a critical need for rapid capital restructuring. Through a labyrinth of newly issued phantom stock options granted exclusively to herself and my mother, they had aggressively and maliciously diluted my foundational ownership stake. They had watered down my equity, dropping it percentage by percentage, until my shares in the company were officially worth exactly 0%. Legally, on paper, they had entirely erased me from the very company I had salvaged with my bare hands. And then, nested inside a separate legal subfolder, I found the ultimate prize. The master document. It was a highly confidential letter of intent from Apex Global Holdings, a massive, notoriously aggressive international conglomerate known for swallowing up premium lifestyle brands. Chloe and Eleanor were not just kicking me out of the house to gain control of the daily operations. They were preparing to cash out entirely. The meticulously drafted document outlined a complete, unconditional acquisition of Simpson Heritage. The purchase price was listed clearly in bold, undeniable ink: $40 million. They had stolen my entire life's work and were preparing to sell it to the highest bidder so they could permanently retire into a life of absolute, unbothered luxury, leaving me with nothing but a cold porch and 2 pieces of luggage. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, my eyes scanning the $40 million figure over and over again. A genuine, terrifying smile spread slowly across my face, breaking the cold stoicism I had maintained all evening. They really thought they had outsmarted me. Chloe genuinely believed her little paperwork coup was a flawless, decisive victory. But the fundamental, catastrophic flaw in their entire grand strategy was their arrogant assumption that I had ever trusted them in the first place. I opened another folder, this one buried behind 3 additional, highly sophisticated layers of biometric and geographic encryption. 5 years ago, when I pulled the company out of its financial death spiral, I realized a dark truth about my own bloodline. Eleanor and Chloe were parasites. I knew with absolute certainty that they would eventually try to drain the host dry the moment the company became truly valuable. So I built a silent, invisible kill switch into the very foundation of the business. When I finalized the core product designs, the proprietary manufacturing processes, the unique material blends, and the distinct trademark aesthetics that made Simpson Heritage so incredibly valuable to a buyer, I did not register those patents and copyrights under the company's name. I never filed the intellectual property into the Simpson Heritage corporate portfolio. Instead, I established a blind, completely anonymous trust based in the state of Delaware. I named the trust the Obsidian Vanguard Entity. I am the sole, absolute, and unchallengeable executor of that trust. The trust owns every single piece of core intellectual property. Simpson Heritage, the company Chloe and Eleanor just illegally seized, merely operates on a temporary licensing agreement that I can revoke at my sole discretion, at any given moment, for any reason whatsoever. My mother and my sister had just stolen an empty hollow shell. Simpson Heritage, without its exclusive design patents, was nothing more than a leased office space, a few pieces of rented furniture, and a completely worthless logo, and the acquiring conglomerate, Apex Global Holdings, was offering $40 million strictly to acquire those proprietary, trademarked assets that my family did not own. I closed the laptop, the screen going black instantly, casting the hotel room back into deep shadows. This was the precise architecture of my deception. If I had knocked on that heavy wooden front door tonight, if I had screamed, cried, and threatened to sue them for the malicious share dilution, I would have triggered a long, messy, and incredibly expensive civil lawsuit. They would have hired aggressive defense lawyers, delayed the court proceedings for years, and played the tearful victims for the press. But by walking away in absolute silence, I was giving them the greatest, most destructive gift a predator can ever give its prey: a false sense of total security. I was going to let their greed inflate to catastrophic proportions. I was going to let Chloe and Eleanor sit in grand, glass-walled boardrooms with the executives of Apex Global Holdings and sign legally binding, strictly regulated acquisition contracts. I was going to sit back and watch them put their signatures on federal corporate documents, officially guaranteeing under oath that they owned multi-million-dollar assets they did not actually possess. I would not say a single word until they had crossed the point of no return. They thought they were selling my company. They did not realize they were enthusiastically signing their own financial death warrants. Over the next 7 days, my family launched a meticulously orchestrated public relations offensive across every major local television network in Denver. Sitting alone in a sticky vinyl booth at a rundown, windowless diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, I watched their performance on a mounted screen. I took a slow sip of my bitter black coffee. The morning talk show host was practically fawning over them. My mother wore a perfectly tailored ivory suit, looking like a graceful, resilient matriarch. Chloe sat beside her, playing the role of the vibrant, innovative corporate successor. The chyron flashing at the bottom of the screen enthusiastically announced the impending mega-merger. When the interviewer inevitably asked about my sudden absence from the executive roster, Chloe adopted a look of practiced, profound sympathy. "My sister poured a lot of heart into the early days of the company," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But the global market is demanding. She simply burned out. She voluntarily stepped down because she realized she no longer had the capacity to keep up with our aggressive expansion strategy. We wish her the absolute best in her much-needed early retirement." They were spinning a public narrative of incompetence to cover their blatant theft. I did not feel a sudden surge of anger. I felt the deep, satisfying anticipation of a patient hunter watching prey wander blindly into a carefully disguised snare. Across the chipped laminate table sat Julian. He was not a flashy corporate attorney in a $5,000 suit. Julian was a legal mercenary, a ghost in the financial district who specialized exclusively in orchestrating hostile takeovers and catastrophic corporate sabotage. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table, his eyes fixed on the television screen above us. "They are remarkably confident for two people currently standing on a live landmine," Julian noted, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They mistake their cruelty for intelligence," I replied, opening the envelope. "Are the federal filings ready?" "Everything is staged on the secure servers," Julian confirmed. "The moment you give the word, we initiate the absolute freeze." I pulled out a sleek metal pen. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I signed my name across the heavy legal parchment, formally executing the kill switch. With those precise strokes of black ink, I officially terminated the master licensing agreement between my anonymous trust and the company. I instructed Julian to immediately file the updated intellectual property ledgers with the Federal Trademark Office in Washington. I froze their right to use the brand name. I froze their right to manufacture the patented physical designs. I legally severed the corporate entity from its own lifeblood. The corporate shell my family now possessed was entirely paralyzed, completely stripped of any legal right to generate a single dollar of commercial revenue. Julian gathered the signed documents and left the diner without another word, slipping silently out into the gray morning air. The trap was permanently set. Now, I just had to watch the heavy steel jaws snap shut. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved a cheap, prepaid mobile phone I had purchased 2 days prior. I had quietly forwarded my primary business number to this untraceable device just to monitor the inevitable fallout. As soon as I powered the screen on, it lit up with a rapid barrage of notifications. There were exactly 47 unread text messages. Every single one of them was from Chloe. I scrolled slowly through the desperate digital monologue. The tone of her messages shifted dramatically over the course of 48 hours, charting a beautiful, rapid descent into quiet panic. The first few messages were overwhelmingly cheerful, dripping with the exact same fake affection she displayed on television. "Hey, big sister. Hope you are getting some well-deserved rest. The lawyers at the acquiring firm just need you to sign off on a minor procedural document to close out your old administrative files. Let me know where to send the courier." 12 hours later, the tone grew slightly more insistent, the punctuation sharper. "Seriously, it is just standard boilerplate stuff. You left some administrative loose ends. Call me back so we can clear this up today." By message number 30, the flawless facade was cracking violently. "This is not funny anymore. The buyers are holding up the asset transfer because they cannot verify the chain of title on the core patents. Stop throwing a bitter tantrum and answer your phone right now." The final message, sent just 10 minutes ago, was a frantic, terrified demand. "Where are you? You cannot do this to us. Call me immediately." They had finally hit the invisible concrete wall. The meticulous corporate lawyers at the acquiring conglomerate had started digging into the deep intellectual property registry and realized the signatures of Eleanor and Chloe meant absolutely nothing. They needed the sole executor of the trust. They needed the ghost they had just tried to bury. I read through every frantic word, my cold smile widening in the dim fluorescent light of the diner. Chloe was begging me to hand over the key to the empire she firmly believed she had already stolen. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not demand a groveling apology. I simply pressed the delete button, erasing the entire panicked thread into the digital void. I powered the device down, plunging them back into absolute terrifying silence. They had confidently severed our ties. Now, I would let them suffocate in the dark, entirely alone in the inescapable labyrinth they had built for themselves. The scheduled date of the final acquisition signature was looming, and the air in Denver felt thick with their unbearable arrogance. To celebrate their impending $40 million payday, my mother and sister did exactly what parasites do when they believe they have found an endless supply of blood. They threw a profoundly garish, unnecessarily extravagant pre-merger gala. They rented out the entirely glass-enclosed, three-story penthouse suite at the very pinnacle of the highest luxury residential tower in the downtown district. It was a staggering display of premature wealth, designed exclusively to flaunt their supposed corporate genius to the high society of the city. They invited 200 of the wealthiest investors, socialites, and fashion influencers in the state. From my vantage point, the party looked like a glittering, chaotic terrarium of profound ignorance. I was not on the guest list, of course. I was standing in total darkness inside an unfinished, completely empty commercial office space on the 42nd floor of the corporate skyscraper positioned directly across the avenue. The raw concrete floors were cold under my boots. I held a pair of heavy military-grade tactical binoculars to my eyes, the high-definition lenses perfectly focused through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of their rented penthouse. I had the ultimate front-row ticket to the final act of their tragicomedy. Through the magnified lenses, I watched my mother holding court near a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture of the company logo. She was draped in a custom emerald silk gown, laughing openly, tossing her head back as she accepted the premature congratulations of investment bankers who knew absolutely nothing about how a real business operated. Chloe was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, floating through the crowded room in a blindingly white designer dress, soaking up the unearned admiration like a dry sponge. They were entirely drunk on their own stolen victory. What they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend as they ate imported caviar and danced to a live string quartet, was the absolute chaos erupting exactly 1,000 miles away. Inside the towering, steel-clad headquarters of Apex Global Holdings, a highly paid team of forensic auditors and senior legal analysts had just smashed face-first into my invisible legal firewall. They had spent the last 48 hours desperately trying to verify the chain of custody for the core patents. Instead of finding my family's names, they had hit a dead end comprised of ironclad federal protections and the impenetrable anonymity of the Obsidian Vanguard entity. The buyers had just realized they were about to write a $40 million check to two women who legally owned absolutely nothing but office chairs and a heavily indebted corporate tax identification number. Through the binoculars, I saw Chloe's diamond-encrusted smartphone light up violently in her clutch purse. I watched her pull it out, her perfect, cosmetically enhanced smile faltering for a fraction of a second as she read the caller identification. It was the lead representative from the acquiring conglomerate. I knew it was him because my legal mercenary, Julian, had confirmed their legal team was in a state of absolute, unprecedented panic. Chloe stepped away from a group of wealthy socialites and pressed the phone to her ear. Even through the thick, soundproof glass separating our two buildings, I could perfectly imagine the desperate, frantic shouting coming from the representative on the other end of the line. The buyer was demanding the real intellectual property ledgers. They were demanding the actual owner of the trust. I watched Chloe wave her free hand dismissively in the air, a gesture of supreme, catastrophic arrogance. I could read her lips perfectly as she spoke into the receiver. "Calm down. It is just a minor paperwork glitch, a tiny administrative oversight by my former sister. Do not ruin my evening with this nonsense. We will sort out the trivial details on Monday morning." She abruptly ended the call, hanging up on a senior federal acquisitions attorney, and immediately flagged down a passing waiter to trade her empty glass for a fresh, overflowing flute of champagne. She genuinely believed her own lies. She believed the universe simply bent to her will because she demanded it. She strutted back into the center of the party, utterly blind to the massive legal guillotine suspended precisely 1 inch above her neck. I lowered the binoculars. The silence in my dark concrete room was beautiful. It was the absolute perfect stillness that precedes a devastating hurricane. I walked over to the single folding table in the center of the empty office, where my encrypted laptop sat open, glowing with a soft, pale blue light. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked forward methodically. 11:55, 11:56. I opened the secure federal court portal. The official legal document was fully uploaded, heavily documented, and aggressively comprehensive. It was a preliminary injunction, a catastrophic legal blockade. I rested my finger lightly on the heavy plastic entry key. 11:58. I looked out the window one last time, watching the glittering, oblivious party across the street. I watched them raise their glasses in a final unified toast to their glorious future. The clock struck exactly 11:59 at night. I pressed the key. The screen flashed green. The injunction was officially filed and instantly legally binding. In that exact fraction of a second, any and all commercial transactions, banking privileges, and asset transfers associated with Simpson Heritage were entirely permanently paralyzed by federal mandate. The trap was locked. The game was over. At precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, the atmosphere inside the primary executive boardroom of Apex Global Holdings was completely sterilized of any warmth or human emotion. Situated on the 60th floor, the room was anchored by a massive, custom-built, solid mahogany table that stretched exactly 30 feet across the thick, sound-dampening carpet. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, commanding view of the Denver skyline, a visual representation of the power the conglomerate wielded. At one end of the expansive table sat my mother and my sister. They were positively radiant, dressed in fresh, runway-exclusive designer suits, projecting the absolute, unwavering confidence of two women who believed they were exactly 5 minutes away from securing a $40 million wire transfer. Chloe had a heavy gold-plated pen resting lightly between her meticulously manicured fingers. Eleanor was already practicing her gracious, aristocratic acceptance smile, nodding politely at the empty leather executive chairs positioned directly opposite them. At exactly 5 minutes past 9, the heavy acoustic doors at the far end of the room did not just open, they were shoved apart with violent force. The chief legal counsel for Apex Global Holdings strode into the boardroom. He was not accompanied by smiling executives holding bottles of expensive champagne or silver trays of pastries. He was heavily flanked by 3 grim-faced senior compliance auditors and 2 aggressive, sharply dressed corporate litigators. The chief counsel did not offer a polite morning greeting. He did not extend his hand for a professional handshake. He walked directly to the head of the mahogany table, raised a thick, red-tabbed legal dossier high in the air, and slammed it viciously against the polished wood. The sharp, concussive crack echoed off the thick glass walls like a gunshot, shattering the quiet elegance of the room. "The acquisition is immediately and permanently terminated," the chief counsel stated, his voice a flat, mechanical drone entirely devoid of any professional courtesy. "Put the gold pen away, Ms. Simpson. There will be no signatures today. In fact, there will be no business conducted with you ever again." Chloe blinked rapidly, her perfect, highly practiced smile freezing into a grotesque mask of confusion. "I beg your pardon? If this sudden hostility is regarding the minor administrative delay I mentioned on the phone last night, I can personally assure you—" "It is not an administrative delay," the lawyer interrupted, his tone as hard and unforgiving as concrete. "It is a catastrophic, fraudulent misrepresentation of corporate assets. At exactly 11:59 last night, a federal judge granted a blanket, multi-jurisdictional injunction against Simpson Heritage. You have been completely locked out of the commercial market. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your operational licenses are suspended." He ripped open the red dossier and shoved a heavy stack of federal court filings across the smooth mahogany surface. It slid rapidly and stopped precisely in front of Chloe. "Our forensic audit team worked through the entire night," the chief counsel continued, his eyes locked onto Chloe with absolute disgust. "We discovered the absolute truth you deliberately tried to hide behind your public relations campaigns. Simpson Heritage does not own a single proprietary design. You do not own the manufacturing patents. You do not even own the legal trademark to the logo printed on the letterhead you used to negotiate with our firm. The entire intellectual property portfolio, the very core of what makes this brand profitable, belongs exclusively to an anonymous Delaware trust. The company you brazenly attempted to sell us for $40 million is nothing but a completely hollow, worthless shell. You tried to sell us stolen air. Chloe's face lost all of its color in a single second, shifting rapidly from flushed, arrogant excitement to a sickly, translucent white. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy gold pen slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly onto the wooden table. She looked down at the court documents, her eyes frantically scanning the dense, unforgiving legal text, desperately searching for a loophole or a typographical error that simply did not exist. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking painfully into a high-pitched rasp. "That is factually impossible. We own the company. We legally restructured the shares. We have the signed board resolutions right here in our files." "You own a dead corporate tax identification number," the chief counsel fired back mercilessly, stepping closer to the table. "And what is infinitely worse for you, you aggressively leveraged it. Our background financial investigations show that to finance your extravagant lifestyle over the past 30 days, including that ridiculous, highly publicized penthouse gala last night, you took out massive, high-interest bridge loans from private, unregulated lenders. You explicitly used the anticipated payout from this now-canceled merger as your primary collateral." The reality of the mathematics hit Chloe like a physical, devastating blow to the chest. Without the $40 million acquisition capital, the $3 million in predatory bridge loans they had recklessly spent on designer wardrobes, public relations retainers, and luxury venue rentals were no longer secured by corporate equity. In the span of a single conversation, those loans had instantly converted into a crushing, unpayable, personal debt. The private lenders would not seize a worthless company. They would seize their homes, their cars, and every single personal asset they possessed. Eleanor finally found her voice, though it was pathetically weak and shaking uncontrollably. "There has to be a misunderstanding here. We can fix this immediately. We just need to contact the trust executor and negotiate a release." "The executor of the trust is the exact person who filed the injunction to destroy you," the lawyer stated coldly. He leaned forward, planting his heavy knuckles on the mahogany table, looming over the two trembling women. "Apex Global Holdings does not tolerate being utilized in amateur financial scams. You drafted fraudulent letters of intent. You deliberately transmitted falsified asset declarations across state lines. Under the law, that constitutes federal wire fraud. Our legal department is currently drafting a comprehensive, fully evidenced report to submit directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation by noon today. We are going to sue you into total bankruptcy for the full cost of our wasted legal and auditing fees, and then we are going to hand your files over to the federal prosecutors." The sheer, suffocating gravity of the situation finally crushed the last remaining ounce of arrogance out of the boardroom. There was no clever public relations spin that could fix a federal indictment. There was no charming magazine interview that could pacify a ruthless private debt collector or a federal judge. Eleanor let out a horrific, guttural sound, a pathetic wheeze of absolute terror, and collapsed heavily back into her expensive leather chair. Her perfect posture crumbled entirely, her high-end designer suit suddenly looking like a poorly fitted costume draped over a very old, very broken woman. The sprawling, glamorous empire they firmly believed they had brilliantly stolen had evaporated into absolute nothingness in less than 5 minutes. They were left with exactly 0 assets, millions of dollars in aggressive personal debt, and the terrifying, immediate, and inescapable threat of federal prison. The heavy acoustic doors of the boardroom swung open once more, breaking the suffocating tension that had consumed the space. I walked into the expansive room, my footsteps entirely silent on the thick carpet. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray bespoke suit that commanded absolute authority. In my right hand, I held a simple paper cup of black coffee, the steam rising softly in the chilled, heavily air-conditioned air. My demeanor was as completely undisturbed and placid as a frozen winter lake. I did not glare at the two women sitting at the far end of the table. I did not offer a vindictive smirk or a look of triumph. True, unassailable power does not require a theatrical performance. It simply exists, vast and undeniable. The aggressive, rigid posture of the chief legal counsel instantly dissolved into one of profound professional deference. He stepped aside, gesturing toward me with an open palm. "Ladies, allow me to introduce the sole executive officer of the trust we just discussed," the lawyer stated calmly. "She is the exclusive owner of the proprietary assets you illegally attempted to fence. Going forward, she is the only authorized individual our conglomerate will negotiate with regarding any future licensing agreements." Chloe's eyes darted wildly toward me. Her face, already drained of its vibrant color, seemed to completely collapse inward, the underlying muscles giving way to absolute terror. The brutal reality of the absolute checkmate finally bypassed her profound, blinding arrogance. She lunged forward against the heavy polished wood. "Natalie, please! You cannot do this to us! You have to give the patents back to the family. We will lose the estate. We will go to federal prison." She was practically screaming now, ugly, guttural sobs tearing aggressively through her throat. Her flawless designer makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks, completely ruining her carefully curated image. Beside her, Eleanor was shivering uncontrollably, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish, utterly paralyzed by the sheer, crushing magnitude of her own sudden ruin. I stood at the head of the table and looked down at them. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a lengthy lecture on morality, loyalty, or the catastrophic, inevitable consequences of their unchecked greed. Arguing with them would falsely imply that their opinions, their tears, or their existence still held some sort of emotional value to me. They did not. Instead, I calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I slowly withdrew the wrinkled, fluorescent yellow sticky note. It was the exact same cheap piece of paper Chloe had carelessly slapped onto my luggage just over a week ago. I placed it flat onto the polished mahogany surface. With a single deliberate flick of my index finger, I slid the note across the long table. It glided smoothly, stopping precisely in front of Chloe's trembling, manicured hands. She stared down at her own jagged handwriting as if it were a highly venomous snake. "Simpson Heritage is yours," I stated, my voice completely hollow, entirely devoid of any sympathy, anger, or malice. "It is all yours, along with every single dollar of the massive, unpayable debt it now carries. I did not steal a single thing from you. I simply took away the very things I created with my own two hands." That simple, undeniably objective truth shattered their final, desperate illusion of salvation. As the horrific, piercing sounds of Chloe weeping and begging loudly echoed against the thick glass walls of the boardroom, I simply turned my back. I walked out through the heavy doors without a single backward glance, leaving them to drown permanently in the shallow, pathetic graves they had so enthusiastically dug for themselves. I rode the silent elevator all the way down to the ground floor. I stepped out through the revolving glass doors and into the sharp, brilliant sunlight of the Denver sky. The freezing morning air filled my lungs, crisp and wonderfully clean. I took a long, deep breath. For the first time in 32 years, my shoulders felt incredibly light. I was no longer carrying the suffocating, ungrateful weight of my bloodline. I had not just won a corporate war, I had completely reclaimed my own existence. I closed my eyes and simply felt the priceless, absolute peace of a life that finally, entirely belonged to me alone. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.